fellow enthusiasts of international relations. Welcome to today's engaging and insightful discussion on a topic of paramount importance, examining India-Australia relations, brought to you by the Center for Public Policy Research, CPPR, Kochi. I'm Anusri, Associate Research at CPPR. We are honored to have with us a distinguished guest who brings a wealth of expertise and experience to shed light on this multifaceted relationship. Welcome to the show, sir. So, in a world where connectivity and collaboration between nations hold the key to global progress, exploring the intricate dynamics between countries becomes even more crucial. Perhaps the opportunity lies in growing people-to-people connections and understanding of the differences as well as the opportunities between the countries. So as we delve into the intricacies of India-Australia relations, we will undoubtedly uncover certain facets that contribute to both challenges and synergies in bilateral relations, as well as shaping regional geopolitics, ultimately shaping the course of international diplomacy. Before we go further into the discussions, I would like to warmly welcome our esteemed guest for today's discussion, who is none other than Mr. Daniel Flitton, a well-known foreign affairs expert in international affairs and a prominent voice in shaping policy dialogues in Australia. Mr. Flitton is now the managing editor of the Lowy Institute's international magazine, The Interpreter. His keen insights into the complex web of India-Australia relations promise to offer fresh perspectives, guiding us through the labyrinth of historical, cultural, economic, and strategic intersections that define this bilateral partnership. So without further ado, let's embark on a journey of exploration, analysis, and discovery as we navigate the realms of India-Australia relations with Mr. Daniel Flitton as our guide. So join me in extending a warm welcome to our esteemed guest as we prepare to unravel the layers of this partnership and uncover the potential that lies within. So, but before we delve into the nuanced details of diplomacy and strategy, Mr. Flitton, I have heard that you were once part of a Bollywood film. So could you please let us into that one amazing experience before we get into the details of it?
Thanks very much, Anusri. And it's terrific to be part of the Centre for Public Policy Research. I'm joining you from Melbourne, even though the Lowy Institute is based in Sydney. And I was lucky enough a long time ago now, 20 years ago now, when I was traveling in India. It was actually my first trip to India, and I was as a tourist, and I found myself in Mumbai and was approached on the street if I would be an extra in a film. And the next thing I knew, I was dressed as a Canadian Mountie standing next to Sunny Deol, who I subsequently learnt was actually a big actor. I'd never heard of him, and was shaking his hand and was giving a little speech to launch the film as I gave him a reward. And you know, it was a funny experience, and I got paid for it as well. I could have launched a Bollywood career and done something very different to what I do today. But it's made me laugh over the years, and just as a little episode of a reflection of the way in which countries change and globalization affects. We don't talk about globalization nearly as much anymore, but that experience, there I was, an Australian tourist, I'm in Mumbai, I'm pretending I'm in Canada, I'm dressed as a Canadian Mountie. The other extras that were in the film included a guy from Sudan who was a refugee from Sudan who was making a living with his 500 rupees that he got paid as an extra doing these sorts of films. There was another Australian, an older gentleman that was there who ended up playing the Canadian Prime Minister. And there was a whole heap of British wannabe actors who were hanging around in Mumbai and hoping to get a speaking part, and were pretty upset that I'd been chosen, frankly. And that was a sign that was where the opportunities lie. That was the place where they saw that they were able to go and potentially make money and potentially launch a career, given how big Bollywood is as a stage for some people to have success. So it fascinated me looking back on it as the way in which those various different intersections came together.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Fitton. I think we would have loved to have you in the Bollywood as like a very nod face. But again, we are also happy to have you as like a strategist, discussing India-Australia relations as well. So thanks a lot for that charming tale that not only highlights the cultural connections, but it also reminds me like how people to people interactions bridge gaps and build bonds in any particular partnership, and here India-Australia relations. So indeed, as we navigate the intricate landscape of India-Australia relations, we find that culture, people-to-people connectivity stands as a powerful conduit, bridging gaps as well as fostering a mutual understanding between two nations. So cultural diplomacy is a very subtle yet potent force. It has played a significant role in transcending the geographical boundaries and nurturing a deeper understanding of each other's societies as well as values. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of differences as well that we understand about each other through our cultural diplomacy. So we do have a large Indian diaspora in Australia, I believe, and the educational migration from India to Australia are growing at an exponential rate. So, and while we are exploring the impact of these kind of aspects on the bilateral ties, Mr. Fitton, could you please shed light on the role of culture as well as people-to-people engagement in shaping perceptions and strengthening the foundations of India-Australia relationship?
Yeah, certainly. You said exponential for the growth of the Indian diaspora and that connection with Australia, and that's exactly the word. It has been growing at an extraordinary rate in the last decade, 2 decades or so, and as I understand it, it's one of the largest and fastest growing diaspora communities in Australia. And it's an obvious point, but we're all people, and it's through people that we get to better understand other countries. And so each of those Indian migrants that move to Australia become ambassadors for understanding and bridging a gap of understanding between the two countries. Because I would say, and I think it's fair to say, that I think that the understanding of India from Australia is fairly thin, or fairly superficial is perhaps a better way of putting it. And I would carefully say that I think that goes both ways. I don't think that the two countries, or the two people, if you like, understand or have a great depth of understanding one another. I think that there's a few common connections. There's often talk about the 3 C's of a connections between the countries, the cricket, curry, and the Commonwealth. And it's a cliche, and people are sometimes quite disparaging about those ideas. I'm not convinced that that's not the basis for a better understanding and a better connection between the countries. The cricket, for instance, gives a talking point and a rivalry and a position that connects to everyday citizens. That's not about, we're not talking about big geopolitical challenges and that sort of thing, where people's eyes tend to glaze over and they don't necessarily understand it. It's something tangible, it's entertaining, it has a story arc to it, so it can be an opportunity to make connections, but it can't be the only opportunity. And I think that there is a need to better connect. You mentioned education, for instance, but there is also this question about interests. And if we add another C to that connection, another C word to that connection, it's China. Australia's had a huge focus on China as an economic opportunity for a long time. And that's been a very difficult relationship in the last few years, and will continue to be a difficult relationship. And there is now a fair amount of enthusiasm that India is the next big economic opportunity for Australia. But if they're going to take advantage of that, there does need, and for it to be sustainable and for it to have a solid foundation, that it's not subject to political controversies that might throw it off track, as we've seen with the China relationship, then the two countries do need to better understand one another. And I don't know that understanding is quite there at the moment. And it doesn't come from just glossy events. And if I go back to the cricket, it's not going to come when Prime Minister Modi circles around the Modi Stadium in Gujarat with Prime Minister Albanese, as he did earlier this year on a chariot as they went around earlier this year. That's not the depth of understanding. That'll come from the connections that come from migrants. That'll come from people having cross-country education. I would like to see a lot more Australians going to India and studying in India and learning more about India through direct experience, not just, I wouldn't say it's entirely one-way traffic at the moment, but it certainly needs to go both ways.
It is. I think we need more of people-to-people connectivity is the ultimate goal of building relations, and I believe so that kind of builds a lot of importance to how we look at each other, how societies intermingles, and all those things. So I think while we're looking at the blossoming educational ties, we can also see that has also contributed to a skilled workforce. So, and if you are looking at the trade relations between India and Australia in recent years, economics ties have also grown in a considerable way. So what are the key aspects of economic cooperations, and how do these contribute to the prosperity of both nations?
Yeah, I think it comes back to what we were just talking about with the people-to-people connections. And if you use education, for instance, which for a while was and may still be one of Australia's biggest export markets, if we can talk about it like that, and also the idea of Indian students and students from elsewhere in the world coming to Australia and participating in the education opportunities that there are in Australia. That's enormous, because that sets a grounding that people then, through that experience, will hopefully carry through their entire lives, and hopefully they have a great opportunity and a great experience in Australia. The flip side, and I don't mean to focus on negatives, but the flip side is that there can be hurdles that are introduced to the relationship, and we've seen that happen in the past, the not too distant past. So as I mentioned, I'm here in Melbourne, and I used to work as a reporter for this newspaper, which has got a picture of behind me, for the Age newspaper. And 10 years ago, one of the big stories that was always on the front page of the newspaper was a spate of attacks that were seen to be racially motivated. Whether they were or not was debated, but there was a spate of attacks that involved students from India that were living in Melbourne. And some of that undoubtedly did have a prejudicial aspect to it, which then became a major news story in India. And I remember we were getting calls trying to do media from India, we were trying to understand what the hell was going on ourselves, and then we were being asked to explain it. But it was also became evident that there was a series of operators, of unscrupulous operators, if I could put it that way, of colleges within Australia who were not at, say, a university standard or a good college type standard, and they were taking advantage of people. That was essentially what it was. It was taking advantage of people. It was actually offering a pathway for people to do migration, that sort of thing. And then that became a hurdle in the relationship. So I guess the lesson that comes from that is, if you're going to have strong economic relationships, they also need to be well regulated. And that's a challenge for both countries, to make sure that they're aligned, that we don't rush ahead with the prospect of making money and then end up doing ourselves damage as a consequence. And one of the other big controversies that's involved India, not India directly so much, but has been involved with India, has been the idea of a major coal mine in northern Australia, in the state of Queensland, which was to be operated by Gupta Adani, from the Adani Group. And that became a major political controversy, a whole heap of overlapping and overlaying issues there, not to do with India, to do with climate change, to do with people not wanting to see fossil fuels exported, that sort of thing. There was a lot of other politics involved, but it became an issue in relationship. Similarly to, if you go back 10 years, whether or not to export uranium to India was another big hurdle in the Australia relationship with India. So we're not talking about those sorts of obstacles as much the political leaders aren't talking about those sorts of obstacles. They're talking about opportunities. I haven't even mentioned the Quad, but there's all of these big opportunities that are seen as an alignment between the two countries. But you don't have to go too far back in the past to find that there can be some fissures. And unless we are better, and going back to that point, that unless we better understand one another, we're not going to, those things can blow up and then they become a problem in the relationship.
Thanks a lot, sir. So I think, like you have rightly said, like, there are certain challenges, certain hurdles that, that's like, in the past as well as in the contemporary times, there are certain hurdles that we had to overcome, or that are still that we need to address. But I think also, like, certain complementarity due to complementarity of certain resources that we have, the two countries have, and trade in commodities like agricultural products and minerals, as you rightly mentioned. I think it established kind of a strong foundations over the years. And we are now talking about technology, innovation, and foster advancement in research, development, and entrepreneurship. And I think Australia has recently come up with an international development policy yesterday or something. So
Yeah.
I think, so I think there is a lot of, like, I can see that, like, although there are a lot of challenges that exist, the growing investment flows and the strategic partnership in these certain sectors reflect certain kind of commitment to harness innovation as a catalyst for economic growth. So I'm hoping, like, in the future, we will be able to address certain key issues so that we can move forward in a prosperous way. So now coming to the geopolitical seascape, one cannot, you rightly said, like, our relationship is like, it is moving within and beyond the four seas. You added another sea called China as well. So one cannot overlook the strategic significance of the Indian Ocean region, which serves as a pivotal arena for both India and Australia. So the complexities of the global dynamics have drawn these two nations to work together, come closer, propelling them to prioritize and navigate the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean with a shared vision for stability and security. So the strategic priorities that India and Australia pursue in this region are crucial because it is kind of the fabric of their foreign policy for the region, and it also dominates how they perceive each other's presence in the Indian Ocean region. So I know, again, there are a lot of certain challenges in how they perceive Indo-Pacific and their strategies for the Indo-Pacific. But could you please shed light on the strategic priorities Australia has in the Indo-Pacific, and how the Australia is looking to cooperate with India to ensure regional stability and security?
Yeah, it's a great word, strategic. We just sort of throw it like a blanket over a whole range of different policy areas to give it the little bit of extra weight. But it is definitely a significant shift in the last few years, and it comes back to that point on China. But there has been a real effort to better align the two countries and in a sense the four countries with the Quad. And there's a fascinating history as to how that came about, because it actually began out of the Indian Ocean tsunami way back in 2004. It was first suggested as being an opportunity for the countries to cooperate on humanitarian aid and disaster relief, which is a pretty uncontroversial thing to do. Everybody wants help when there's a big disaster like that. And the idea of the countries coming together and being able to work together, that's not so controversial. But when it was then seen as something that was in the sort of 2007 period, there were early complaints from China about this idea of encirclement or containment. There was a pulling back from the Quad arrangement, which has been blamed on Australia. And I still have friends from India who I speak to occasionally who will blame that on Australia because there was having to be a shift of government at that time. But there was also a change. There was also a shift at that time in US interests about its relationships with Iran, about North Korea, all of these various different points on the chessboard that were being moved around. And that alignment then shifted again a few years ago. So the Quad became came back into vogue. And I think that there was some apprehension in India, I think it's fair to say, when there was a change of government in Australia last year with the new Labor government, whether or not there would be the same enthusiasm for the Quad. And Anthony Albanese, the new Prime Minister in Australia, sought as quickly as he could to allay any of that concern, because the first thing he did within hours of being sworn into office was jump on a plane, head up to Japan for the Quad meeting, where he met with Prime Minister Modi as well as his counterparts from the United States and from Japan. And indeed, he wanted to host the Quad earlier this year, but it was cancelled because Biden pulled out of it. They're the mechanics of how it happened. What the point of it all is the strategic alignment that you're alluding to is ultimately concern over China. And for India, that's a concern which is far sharper because you're border countries with one another, and we've had that experience in the last few years in the border regions where there's been essentially a conflict. And for Australia, it's been a political and an economic tension, because China's chosen to respond to Australia with a kind of economic coercion campaign that it's looked to punish Australia. So when you're up against a big country like that, you're looking for friends, and I think that that's partly where the alignment comes. But there's also again some areas where the countries don't neatly align, and that's again something that I don't think it's profits to just gloss it over. India has a different view, for instance, from its other Quad partners about what's happened in Ukraine, for instance, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the Australians, the Japanese, and the Americans have been very forthright in condemning Russia's action, but there's a perception that the Indian government hasn't been. And oil purchases from Russia by India are another issue that can crop up in the relationship. So I guess the issue that I'd say with all of this, and sorry, I don't mean to ramble, but the issue with all of this is that there's the presentation of the Quad and these strategic interests as being one based on values, because they're all democracies together. But I think the far more persuasive basis for understanding the relationship is on interests, that the countries have an alignment of interests. Those interests are not always neatly and perfectly aligned, but when it comes to China, they're quite similar.
You excellently made understand what are the strategic priorities of it. So I have a question that goes well with the previous question that I had asked you. So how does Australia see India's strategic posture, using the word strategic again, in the Indo-Pacific? Like, how do you right now see India's growth as a regional player in the Indo-Pacific region, and perhaps how do you foresee the posture of India in the coming future?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I don't have an easy answer for. I think the thing that's happened is that Australia has been at once encouraging of India to take a more forthright strategic stance in terms of engagement. Australia wanted to be part of the Malabar military exercises, for instance. Australia wanted to encourage India to do more in the Indian Ocean region, more cooperation with Australia in a military sense, and that sort of thing. But I think it's also gone both ways. I think that India has looked to Australia. I used to read a lot of cables from the 1960s in a previous job that I had when I worked on it as a historian. And there's always been ambition for the relationship, but there hasn't been, while there's plenty of ambition, there hasn't been the impetus, there hasn't been something to propel the countries to work towards one another. Now that China has grown so large and is seen, rightly or wrongly, as a threat, that impetus for Australia and India to work together has grown. So I think from the Australian side, it's a hope to encourage India to have a greater ambition in the region. But I think from the Indian side, it's a search, as has been put it at different times, a look east policy, a search for different friends, a willingness to escape from the old bounds of the being constantly tied up with Pakistan and the issues in that relationship, and to actually look to a wider world. And some of that comes back to needing for countries like Australia to deal with India on India's terms. Australia can't, I have a different view on this, but the Australians have decided that they're not going to just try and punish India for standing outside of the non-proliferation nuclear proliferation apparatus, the international mechanisms to try and stop countries having nuclear weapons. They've effectively accepted that India is now a nuclear power, and they'll deal with India as a nuclear power. That's a change from Australia's side, and that's an effort to try and encourage more cooperation with India and just accepting that.
Thanks a lot. So, as we come towards the end of this presentations, can you tell me what are the key challenges? Like you already mentioned that we have certain divergent views about certain global issues that's happening, and India is stressing more on the strategic autonomy part, and while cooperating in platforms like Quad. So looking ahead, what are the potential areas of cooperation do you see for India and Australia, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and the maritime security aspects? And how do you envision the relationship evolving over the coming years?
Well, I'm going to confess, Anasri, I seem to be permanently programmed to look for the problems more than the opportunities. So I would come back to a couple of issues. One is for Australia to better understand India's politics, to be able and that means that we need, and it goes back to that very first point, we need to better understand, have a better connection between the two countries. I've done various different jobs through my life. I've been lucky. I've worked as a public servant. I worked as an academic, but I also worked as a journalist. It's no good that Australia only has one permanent correspondent in India, a country as big as India is and as diverse as India is, that Australia is for the media to have no permanent correspondence there. But that, again, that goes both ways. Yeah, we need to see more Indian coverage of Australia. It's not the biggest country in the world, and the relationship there's a great disparity between the two nations, or a great asymmetry, I should say. But for Australia, we can't pretend to want to make India our new best friend and not understand and not cover the country in terms of the media and be able to inform the Australian public about what's happening in India. So that's where I'd love to see. I think there's an opportunity in all that. It's a problem, but it's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that we can fix. And I think it's for a challenge for Australians. I think Australians have to get used to, I mentioned asymmetry. Australians have to get used to India being a much bigger partner. And that's going to mean that we're not going to get our way. And we're going to have to be ready to be uncomfortable with some aspects of that relationship. And there's complaints occasionally about issues in India that with Kashmir, and more recently with Manipur, and what's happening there, with the perceptions of the character of the Modi government. And that then comes in return with complaints like was made when Prime Minister Modi visited Australia earlier this year and talked about the Khalistan issues and the questions around with Sikhs. And that makes for uncomfortable politics within Australia as well, particularly when the countries are seen to be partners together. So I think that the media has a great opportunity for better educating and better promoting and understanding between the two nations. I think that there's a bureaucratic challenge between the two countries. You don't have to go back too long, and I don't know what the figures are these days, but you don't have to go back too long to see in the Indian Ministry for External Affairs, for instance, there was barely any officers that worked full-time on Australia or on the Pacific. Now, that may well have changed recently, and I don't know what the up-to-date numbers are, but there's there's a perception of an inertia within the bureaucracy at times. And that, again, probably goes both ways. I think the biggest opportunity is in the business links, and you alluded to that earlier. And I think that the entrepreneurial spirit, the chance for the two countries to better cooperate on the development of new technologies, particularly as we transition to dealing with a reality of a climate changed, and all of those economic opportunities that come with that. It's not for Australia about just digging stuff out of the ground and shipping it overseas, which was the model that we had with China, and it led to great wealth for Australia. But there is this chance for a more cooperative, collaborative approach, hopefully better economic connections between the two countries so that they both can get rich together. And in that sense, we have a better opportunity for people, to have a better life. So yeah, there's an alignment there, as long as we understand where the cracks are in the relationships and work on those together. It is going to be awkward at times, and we should be comfortable being uncomfortable is one of the things that I think is going to have to be. The partnership is going to be a rocky one, but at times, but I think that there will be tremendous opportunities.
Thanks a lot for this engaging session. So as we come to the end of the session, we can rightly say that India-Australia relations is growing, although like you have rightly predicted, we're going to have a bit of uncomfortable times, and our relation and our diplomatic progress lies in how we're going to maneuver through the uncomfortable times. So at the same time, we have a lot of prospects in maritime security cooperation, like you rightly said, the entrepreneurial community, how we are building the business environment for India and Australia to invest on each other, and building an economic relations based on people-to-people connectivity. So thanks a lot, sir, for for these engaging sessions. We really look forward to continue hosting us in our conversations. And we will be back with other engaging and insightful discussions soon. Signing off.